The dog didn't bark, didn't whimper, didn't flinch. It just lay there, coiled like a shadow in the farthest kennel, eyes fixed on a blank concrete wall as if it were watching ghosts rise from the paint. Other dogs barked and jumped, desperate for attention. But not this one. He made no sound, no movement. It was the kind of silence that didn't beg for mercy. It had already stopped asking. Walter Grant wasn't here to adopt. He'd come to drop off donations, an old bed, a leash, and a half-used bag of premium senior dog food he'd kept in the garage for 6 months since his retriever Bailey passed. Just clearing space, that's all. That's what he told himself. But when he reached the back of the Haven Hills shelter and saw him, the emaciated German shepherd lying stiffly against the cinder-block wall, Walter stopped cold. There was something about the dog's eyes. Not pleading, not frightened, just waiting. A young staffer, barely out of high school, noticed his stare. "He's not available," she said quickly, stepping in front of Walter like she needed to protect him. "That one's on medical watch. He's not doing great." Walter didn't answer. He was already walking closer. "Sir," the girl started. "I'm not touching him," Walter said without turning. "Just looking." The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the dog's rib cage. Patches of fur were missing along his flanks. One ear twitched at Walter's voice. That was the only sign of life. "What's his name?" "We just call him Shadow," the girl answered reluctantly. "He doesn't respond to anything. Military working dog. Came from a base outside Yuma. Supposedly saw action in Afghanistan, but the paperwork's a mess. Handler KIA. He was found sitting under a flagpole in 112-degree heat. Wouldn't move. They thought he was feral at first." Walter nodded once. He knew that look. He'd seen it in the mirror the day after Evelyn died. The day he couldn't bring himself to turn off her alarm clock, just let it ring until the batteries died. That same look. Absent, but stubbornly here. "He's been here 3 weeks," the staffer continued. "Won't eat, won't interact. The vet says he's shutting down. Honestly, we're just keeping him comfortable until—" Her voice trailed off, but the message was clear. Shadow's tags clinked faintly as he shifted. Not toward Walter, just away from the wall. It was enough. Walter took a slow breath, blinked at the sting behind his eyes. "Can I sit?" The girl hesitated. "He bit a volunteer last week." "I'm not a volunteer," Walter said. "I'm just tired." She didn't know what to say to that. Walter eased down, back to the opposite wall, careful not to get too close. The concrete floor was cold through his jeans. Shadow didn't acknowledge him. They sat in silence. The girl finally drifted away. In the distant kennels, other dogs continued to bark and whine, but here in this hallway it was quiet. Still. Walter stared at the tags clipped to the dog's battered collar. "Military issue. MWD-AX2147. One tag would have the dog's ID, the other his handler's information. In the service you were never alone, not even in death." Walter spoke softly. "At ease, soldier." For a moment, nothing. Then, almost imperceptibly, Shadow's ear moved. Just once. It was the first voluntary reaction he'd shown in days, and it hit Walter like a punch to the chest. He didn't speak again. He just sat there, shoulder aching from the way the cold pressed against old joints, lungs heavy in that specific way grief made them. The longer he sat, the more he could feel Evelyn in that quiet space. Her voice was always clearer in silence. Don't let anything else die alone in that house. Shadow didn't move again, but he hadn't turned away either. The shelter manager found them 30 minutes later. "You okay, sir?" Walter stood slowly. His knees popped as he straightened, and he looked down at the dog with something between recognition and decision. I'll take him." The manager blinked. "Sir, I don't think you understand. This isn't your average shelter dog. He's been through war. He's traumatized. He hasn't responded to medication, stimulation, behavioral therapy, nothing." Walter didn't flinch. "I've been through war too. Mr. Grant, Walter Grant, airframe mechanic, retired, 65 years old, widower, live alone in a house that's too damn quiet. I'm not here for a therapy dog. I'm here because that dog's going to die if someone doesn't sit beside him long enough to remind him he's still here." The manager studied him carefully. "He's not house-trained. He might never be. And we can't guarantee safety or recovery." "I don't need guarantees," Walter said. "I just need a reason to get up in the morning." The pause stretched too long. Then the man sighed. "We'll need you to sign a release." "Of course." "And he has to be moved today." "I'll get the truck." Shadow didn't move when Walter returned with the crate. Didn't resist. Didn't react. Just let himself be lifted gently, like cargo. The girl at the front desk stared. "No one's wanted him," she said, stunned. "Not one person in 3 weeks." Walter didn't answer. He was too busy wondering why the hell he felt like he'd just been chosen. They drove in silence, the Arizona heat pressing through the windshield like a threat. Shadow curled into the far corner of the bench seat, head resting on his paws, eyes open but unfocused. Walter kept glancing at him in the rear view. "You and me," he murmured. "Two old bones pretending we're not broken." As they pulled into the driveway of his quiet stucco home at the edge of town, something strange happened. Shadow sat up, not fully, not all the way, but enough to look, really. Look at the house. His head tilted, his ears twitched, and then he exhaled, like the weight of dying had lifted, just enough to allow breathing again. Walter noticed he didn't say a word. He just opened the door and waited. Shadow didn't move. "Load up," Walter said quietly. A command. Military. Familiar. Shadow stared at him for a long moment. Then slowly, stiffly, he obeyed. Walter's hands trembled on the leash, not from age, from hope. Something had shifted, he didn't know what, but it started in that moment when no one wanted this sad dog. And everything began to change. Walter Grant stood in the doorway of his garage, the sun already burning holes through the morning calm. The crate sat empty in the bed of his truck. Inside the garage, Shadow lay still on the concrete floor like a forgotten statue. He hadn't moved since the moment Walter opened the crate. Walter hadn't expected a miracle. But he also hadn't expected silence this complete. No growl, no shift of weight. Just breathing, thin, shallow, resigned. The night before had been brutal. Shadow had curled himself into the tightest corner of the crate, muscles rigid, eyes half-lidded but alert. Walter had left the door to the crate open, placed water beside it, and sat nearby with a blanket and a thermos of black coffee. He said nothing. Did nothing. Just existed. He remembered nights like that in hangars and outposts, when silence was the only way to stay sane. When the thing lying next to you might not make it till morning. You didn't speak to it. You just stayed. That's what he did now. "You're not the first soldier I've waited out," he muttered, easing himself onto an overturned milk crate. Shadow didn't move. It had been 2 years since Evelyn died. Her reading glasses still sat on the counter, folded atop her last half-finished crossword. Walter had never touched it. Couldn't. Her scent was fading from the pillows, but the lavender sachet she'd tucked in her sweater drawer was still strong enough to knock the wind out of him if he opened it too fast. The house had been a kind of tomb ever since. And then there was the promise, the last real thing she ever said to him, whispered so faintly through morphine breath he wasn't sure at first he'd heard it right. "Promise me you won't let anything else die alone in this house." He had said yes, mostly to comfort her, but now, staring at the broken shell of a war dog lying motionless on his garage floor, it didn't feel abstract anymore. It felt literal. It felt urgent. Walter stood and walked toward the fridge in the garage. He cracked open a carton of eggs, scrambled one up in the microwave, and brought it back in a plastic bowl. Steam rose from the mixture. He placed the bowl 6 feet from the crate and stepped back. "Smells better than the junk the shelter had, huh?" Shadow didn't react. But 15 minutes later, when Walter returned from the kitchen with his second cup of coffee, the bowl was empty. The dog hadn't moved, but something had changed. Instinct, discipline, survival. Walter sat again, slower this time. "You want to die," he said softly, "but you're still checking for danger. That means something." Outside, the Phoenix heat was already climbing past 95. Inside the garage, it was stifling, but Walter stayed. The silence was broken only once, at exactly 3:14 a.m. Shadow howled. It wasn't a bark. It wasn't a dream cry. It was the sound of something primal being torn out of flesh, long and broken, like it came from a place buried too deep for language. Walter bolted upright from where he'd dozed off against the wall. His chest seized. He hadn't heard anything that raw since the jungle of 71. Shadow didn't stop for 12 full minutes. And then, as suddenly as it began, he went quiet again. His sides heaved, and he stared at the garage wall like it owed him an answer. The next morning, Walter called the vet. "He hasn't eaten a full meal," Dr. Rebecca Long said when she arrived that afternoon. "He's lost almost 10 pounds in 2 weeks. Dehydration's setting in. I need you to understand, Walter, this isn't just trauma. His organs are starting to fail." Walter watched as she gently approached the crate. Shadow didn't move. She knelt a safe distance away, her voice soft but clinical. "He's disassociating," she continued. "Military working dogs are trained for one handler. When that bond breaks, they sometimes can't come back." "Who was his handler?" Walter asked. She checked her tablet. "Staff Sergeant Elijah Reyes, KIA Eastern Kandahar, IAD strike. Shadow was found lying on top of him. Wouldn't let anyone near the body for 18 hours. They had to sedate him just to separate them." Walter closed his eyes. The jungle had smelled like rot and gun oil. The crash had come fast. 1 second he was tightening bolts on the tail rotor, the next the world went sideways in flames and screams. He remembered Ranger, his scout dog, pulling him free. Barking warnings too late to stop the shrapnel, but enough to save him from bleeding out. Ranger died in his lap. He hadn't thought about that in years. "I can give him something to ease the transition," Dr. Lang said gently, misreading the look in his eyes. Walter looked at her, and his voice was sharper than expected. "He's not a piece of equipment. Number, but he's suffering. He's surviving," Walter corrected. "That's different." Dr. Lang stood. "Then I'll come back in 3 days. If there's no change, I'm going to recommend we talk about humane options. And Walter, I know what you promised Evelyn, but sometimes mercy looks like letting go." He didn't answer. When she left, Shadow raised his head. For the first time. He didn't look at Walter, didn't wag. Just lifted his chin off his paws and stared at the door. "Waiting for him?" Walter asked. "He's not coming, son, but I'm here." Shadow's head lowered again. Walter sat beside him until the sun went down, a wall of old grief pressing into his chest, and something else blooming underneath it. Something new. Not quite hope. But something that felt like it might survive the night. The mornings came early now, not because Walter couldn't sleep, he hadn't slept properly in years, but because Shadow stirred just before sunrise. Not with energy. not with hope. Just a shift in posture, a faint awareness that another day had arrived, and that it hadn't taken him with it. Walter noticed. He noticed everything now. He noticed that Shadow wouldn't eat unless Walter left the bowl and walked away. That he didn't like direct eye contact, but tolerated it from the side. That his ears only responded to certain frequencies, especially ones that sounded like radio static or command cadence. That he never blinked when the wind hit the old garage windows just right, as if listening for something no one else could hear. Walter had turned the garage into a kind of neutral zone. The crate door was gone. A soft bed had replaced the cold floor. There was a fan humming in the corner, and a small speaker playing ambient nature sounds on loop. Not because Shadow needed calming, but because the silence was starting to feel haunted. It had been 5 days since Shadow was brought home, and the vet's 3-day window had come and gone. Dr. Lang hadn't called. Walter suspected she was giving him room to make peace with the inevitable. But something was shifting. Not obvious, not fast, but real. That morning, Walter sat just outside the threshold, cradling a mug of coffee gone cold, watching Shadow from across the space. "You hear the birds?" he asked. "They've been at it for 20 minutes. Bet you'd rather hear gunfire. Familiar's easier than peace, isn't it?" Shadow didn't respond. His eyes remained focused on nothing. Walter set the mug down and crossed the room. Slowly. No sudden movement. He lowered himself to the ground until they were level. "At ease, soldier." Shadow's right ear twitched. It wasn't much, barely a fraction of a second. But Walter saw it, and his breath caught. The dog had heard that phrase hundreds, maybe thousands of times, from one voice, one man. But now, after weeks of nothing, that single command had reached him through a wall he'd built so thick even hunger couldn't breach it. "You remember that, don't you?" Walter said, voice low and steady. "You're trained not to react, but your body still knows." Shadow blinked once. Not toward Walter, just a single, slow blink, like the light had finally changed inside his head. It was the smallest crack in the armor, but Walter had seen men walk through fire for less. He stayed there until his knees went numb. Didn't speak again. Didn't move. Just sat in silence while Shadow drifted into sleep with one ear still tilted in his direction. Later that afternoon, Walter drove to the animal shelter to return the last of Bailey's items, a donation he hadn't been ready to complete a week earlier. The staff greeted him with polite surprise. The front desk volunteer, a college-aged kid named Clay, lit up. "Hey, Mr. Grant, how's the dog? Still with you?" Walter nodded. "Still breathing. Better than he was here." Walter glanced toward the adoption wall, where Polaroids of successful pairings covered a corkboard. Smiling families, wagging tails, kids with ice cream smeared across their faces, hugging mutts like treasure. He pointed to the end of the hall. "That last kennel, the one on the left, it was Shadow's, right?" Clay blinked. Yeah, far back corner." "Can I take a look?" "Sure, I mean, it's empty now. We sanitized it, but yeah." Walter walked through the corridor of chain-link pens, past the chaos of bouncing paws and barking throats, until he reached the final door. It was just a space, just a slab of concrete and chain, like every other pen. But when he stepped close and looked down, something caught the light. A smear, a faint one, like dried nose print against the inside of the plexiglass. He crouched, adjusted his angle, realized there were multiple prints, smudges made by a large dog pressing its muzzle repeatedly to one spot. Not pacing, not trying to escape, just placing. Like he'd been watching something. Walter stood, heart ticking harder than he liked. He turned to Clay. "Did he do that often?" "What?" "Stand like this, head against the glass, looking out?" Clay nodded. Yeah, never moved, just stared straight down the hall. Gave me the creeps, like he was waiting for someone to show up. Walter's chest tightened. He remembered his time in the jungle, the way Ranger used to sleep with his nose aimed towards the trail, the way Evelyn used to sit on the porch every morning for 2 months after his last deployment, staring at the driveway long before the army confirmed he was still alive. Some things are universal. Grief, waiting, the hope that ignores all reason. He drove home in silence, fingers drumming the steering wheel. When he opened the door to the garage, Shadow was standing. Not moving much, but upright. His body was shaky, and his front paw hovered slightly off the ground like it hurt. But he was standing and facing the door, waiting. "I went to see your cell," Walter said. "Same corner, same glass. You left your mark there, like you needed to prove you'd been waiting." Shadow didn't move, but he didn't sit either. Walter stepped closer, no rush in his movement. When he reached the bed, he crouched and opened his hand. In it sat a single dog tag, an extra one the shelter had forgotten in the paperwork. He placed it gently beside Shadow's bowl. "Your name, your number. The other tag, his, is still missing." Shadow looked at the tag, then back at the door. "You're not waiting for food," Walter said softly. "You're waiting for him." Shadow's body tensed, but he didn't flinch. "I don't know where he is," Walter whispered. "But I can promise you this, soldier, you won't die wondering." Shadow's head lowered slightly. Not from fear, recognition, acceptance. He laid down, this time with his paws stretched forward, facing Walter. And for the first time, when Walter stepped back and turned to go, Shadow watched him leave. Eyes tracking him. No growl, no tail wag. Just that look behind the glass. The one that said, "I'm still here, and maybe, just maybe, I'm not done yet." Walter didn't turn on the porch light. He parked the truck just shy of the garage, stepped out into the crisp Arkansas air, and walked slowly around to the passenger side, where Shadow lay curled in the back seat. The dog hadn't made a sound the entire ride. Not a whine, not a shift. Just that deep, impenetrable stillness of something that had once been wild and brave and broken into pieces too small to find. "You ready?" Walter asked, voice low. Shadow didn't move. It took 10 minutes to coax him out. Not with force, not even with food. Just patience. A slow, open palm, a soft whistle, a step back. Eventually the Malinois dropped his front paws to the ground, back legs stiff as if expecting pain, then followed Walter into the dim light of the converted garage. The space was simple: clean bedding, a heater, fresh water, food bowl. A folded army blanket lay near the back wall, and a cushion sat beside it. Not for Shadow. For Walter. He didn't intend to leave him alone that night. He couldn't. Walter pulled a wool throw around his shoulders and sat against the garage wall, his legs stretched out towards the center. He could feel the ache in his knees already, but ignored it. What mattered now was proximity. Shadow was watching him, not directly but from the corners of his eyes, hyper-aware, calculating. Not of danger, of betrayal. That Walter knew too well. Trust wasn't earned with words. The silence inside the garage grew thick. Only the hum of the small heater and the occasional creak of cooling wood filled the space. Outside, wind drifted through pine branches, brushing the side of the house like distant footsteps. Walter's eyes stayed open long past midnight. He was used to this, these ghost hours. At 3:14 a.m., it began. It wasn't a bark. It wasn't even a growl. It started low in Shadow's chest, almost like a hum, but rose into something else, something ancient, a sound that didn't belong to any household pet or obedient working dog. It was the kind of sound that came from memory, from grief too large to name. A single, hollow howl, long, ragged, drawn from the marrow, It echoed in the garage and slipped through the vents into the yard, floating over fences and hedges like a mourning bell. Across the road, lights flicked on in the Kellys' window. The neighborhood's older black lab started barking into the dark. Someone shouted from 2 blocks over, "Shut your damn dog up!" But Walter didn't move. He sat there, eyes open, face unreadable, breathing slow. It wasn't the sound that shook him. It was the silence after. The weight of it. He remembered it too well. He had heard that same note 50 years ago beside the twisted remains of a downed medevac when a boy named Curtis Foster died with half his ribs gone and a photo of his fiancée clenched in his fist. That night, Walter hadn't cried. He'd just sat in the dirt, listening to the wind whistle through broken metal and the crackle of radio static. Now, here he was again. Different war, different casualty. But the grief sounded the same. Shadow lowered his head after the howl. He didn't look at Walter, didn't come closer. He just curled into himself, body taut, eyes wide open. Walter finally spoke. "I know that sound," he said. "I know what it means when no one answers back." Shadow's breathing slowed, though his chest still trembled. "I'm not going to pretend I can fix you. Hell, I couldn't even fix myself," Walter whispered. "But I'll be here when it comes again." He didn't expect a response. He didn't get one. But Shadow didn't howl again. By dawn, both of them were still awake, eyes red, joints stiff. But something had shifted. At 7:10 a.m., just as the sun slipped a line of gold across the floorboards, Shadow stood up and walked to the food bowl. He didn't eat, just stood there, hovering, nose inches above the kibble, as if testing whether it was safe. Walter watched from the corner. "You don't have to rush it," he murmured. "Neither of us eats right away anymore." The next knock was unexpected. 3 sharp raps on the garage door. Walter tensed, then cracked it open. Outside stood Officer Laura McKay, the town's only animal control officer. "Morning," she said, hands stuffed in her coat pockets. "You got a call from your neighbor. Said she heard a dog wailing like someone was being murdered." Walter blinked. He's a combat vet. Dreams loud. Laura's eyes softened. She stepped back, peering into the garage. "That the Malinois from the shelter? The one no one wanted?" Walter nodded. Laura tilted her head. "Most dogs whimper or bark. But that one? I've only heard that sound once, back when we pulled a police dog from a collapsed building during Katrina." Walter didn't speak. He didn't need to. Laura exhaled, half a smile tugging at her lips. "Well, for what it's worth, that dog ended up becoming the calmest animal I ever saw around dying people. Almost like he knew how to carry pain without spreading it." Walter looked back toward Shadow, who was now curled beside the heater. Not asleep, but watching. Always watching. He turned back to Laura. "Yeah," he said softly. "I think this one might be the same." She gave a small nod and stepped off the porch. "Just tell the neighbors he's not a ghost." Walter let the door close behind him. He looked back at Shadow, eyes meeting for a brief second. "You're not a ghost, huh?" Walter murmured. "Then I guess I'm not either." Neither of them moved. But that morning, Walter put his own blanket a few inches closer to the bed, and Shadow didn't flinch. Walter wasn't supposed to have Lucy that weekend. Her mom had an unexpected shift at the hospital, and her dad was on a cross-state delivery run. So there she was, 9 years old, curious as ever, feet swinging from the edge of the garage workbench like she belonged there. Which, in a way, she did. She had her grandfather's eyes and her grandmother's blunt honesty. And like both, she didn't know how to be quiet when something tugged at her curiosity. Shadow stayed curled under the table near the back wall, head low, paws tucked in, always watching, but never participating. 2 weeks in the garage now, and while he tolerated Walter's presence, he hadn't let anyone touch him. Lucy was determined to change that. She had brought a stack of photos in a shoebox, some from Walter's old military albums, some printed from the internet. She called it her history collection. She laid them out on the concrete floor like a museum curator, glancing at Shadow between each image as if silently asking for his approval. "This one's from Vietnam," she said, pointing at a black and white photo of her grandfather standing beside a downed Huey. "That's you, right?" Walter nodded from his stool. "About 100 years ago, yeah." Lucy giggled. "And this one's Afghanistan. I looked it up. That's where the Malinois dogs helped the Marines. They did, missions and everything." Walter raised an eyebrow. "You've been doing your homework." She beamed. "Yeah, I like learning about heroes." She held up a photo. A dusty road, a low-slung outpost, jagged mountains in the distance. "This place is called Kandahar," she said, testing the word like it was a secret code. That's when it happened. A sound, a breath more than a noise, escaped Shadow. His ears, always back or flat, suddenly pricked up. Slowly he lifted his head. Lucy froze. Shadow stared straight at her, eyes locked on the photo. Walter leaned forward, his mug forgotten in his hand. "Say that again," he said softly. Lucy blinked. "Kandahar." Shadow stood. No growl, no bark, no fear. He walked toward Lucy, not a sprint, not a threat, but a slow, deliberate movement. His paws clicked once on the concrete, then softened, as if he were trying to move through memory without disturbing it. He stopped in front of the photo and sat. Lucy looked up at Walter, wide-eyed. "What just happened?" Walter didn't answer. Shadow leaned forward, nose trembling. He didn't touch the photo but hovered above it. A quiet whine curled from his throat, sharp and raw and broken. Walter knelt beside him. "You were there," he whispered. "Weren't you, boy?" Shadow didn't move, but his eyes never left the image. Lucy knelt down, her tiny hand gripping Walter's sleeve. "What's wrong with him?" Walter stared at the dog, pieces clicking into place faster than he wanted to admit. "He's not just sad," Walter said. "He's waiting." "For what?" Walter didn't answer right away. He reached slowly toward Shadow, careful not to startle. For the first time, Shadow didn't pull back. His fur quivered under Walter's touch. Walter's voice was lower now, measured, like he was back in a war-zone briefing room. Dogs like him, they were trained to lock onto names, phrases, places. They don't forget. That word, Kandahar, it's not just a place to him. It's a trigger. Lucy looked up. A memory. "Maybe more," Walter said. "Maybe someone said it when he was hurt. Or maybe he was left behind there. Maybe he's still waiting for someone to come back from that place." Shadow lowered his head onto Walter's knee. Not in surrender, in connection. A bond formed, not with treats, not with toys, but with a single word and a buried past. Walter exhaled, rubbing the dog's neck gently. "You were part of a unit, weren't you?" he said. "A name, a call sign, something they called you." Lucy tilted her head. "What's his name, then?" Walter didn't answer right away. He looked at the faint scar running down the dog's flank, the one the vet said matched IED shrapnel. A word surfaced from memory. A name he'd read on a damaged intake form from the shelter, but hadn't thought twice about. "Shadow," he said. "They called you Shadow." The dog's tail twitched once, barely. Lucy gasped. "He knows it!" Walter stared at him. "You do, don't you?" Shadow looked up. His eyes, for the first time, weren't blank. They were searching. Not for food, not for escape, for something else. Recognition. Safety. Maybe even purpose. Lucy whispered, "Shadow, This time, his ears lifted higher. Walter stood. "That's it then. You're not a stray anymore. You've got a name." A silence settled in the garage. Not heavy this time. Not like grief. More like a held breath. Lucy reached out, her fingers just brushing the edge of Shadow's ear. He didn't move. Didn't flinch. And just like that, a line had been crossed. A fragile, invisible wall broken down by a child's word and an old man's memory. Later that night, Walter found himself staring at the photo Lucy had left on the workbench. Kandahar, the shadows of mountains behind the outpost, the kind of place men leave pieces of themselves in. Shadow lay by the door, asleep for once, not tense, not half alert, just breathing slow, tail twitching softly in a dream. Walter sat beside him, rubbing his own knees. "You're not waiting anymore," he said. "Now you're home." The heater clicked on. Shadow didn't wake. But that night, he didn't howl either. Walter stood in the garage just before dawn, steam curling from his coffee mug, his breath fogging in the cold morning air. Shadow sat by the door, watching him like a soldier awaiting orders. Something had shifted since the Kandahar moment. The word had stirred something buried, something rigid and deeply trained. But Walter knew it wasn't enough to stir a memory. Not for a dog like Shadow. He needed purpose. Dogs like him didn't just recover with love and softness. They needed structure, mission, orders. That morning, Walter made a choice. He would stop treating Shadow like a broken pet and start treating him like what he truly was, a veteran. "All right, soldier," he said, sipping his coffee. "Time for PT." At 700 sharp, Walter walked out onto the frost-bitten backyard in boots and flannel. Shadow followed, cautious but alert. The first few days were rough. Walter used basic commands. Sit, down, heel, spoken clearly, confidently, not with affection but with clarity. Shadow responded slowly, like a rusty gear grinding back into motion. But he responded. The second morning, Shadow beat him to the door. The third morning, when Walter whistled, Shadow didn't just come, he sprinted. The fourth, he barked once. Not at danger, not at fear, at excitement. It was small, but Walter noticed. He introduced simple obstacle drills using overturned barrels and an old sawhorse. At first, Shadow hesitated, but when Walter raised his voice, firm, never angry, and pointed, Shadow stepped into motion. Hurdle, crawl, sit, watch. Somewhere in the middle of the second week, it stopped being rehab. It started being routine. And with routine came something even rarer. Play. It was Lucy who saw it first. She had stopped by after school, plopped onto the grass with a bright green tennis ball. Walter didn't expect anything. Shadow hadn't shown interest in toys, only commands. But Lucy was Lucy, unbothered by expectations. She rolled the ball toward him. Shadow watched it with narrowed eyes. His ears flicked. His tail didn't move. Lucy shrugged. "Too soon," she said, but Walter saw the twitch. The next morning, after drills, Walter tried again. No words, just a bounce of the ball on the dirt. Shadow didn't chase it, but he watched it roll, watched it with more than curiosity, with consideration. By the end of that week, he chased it. No tug-of-war, no retrieving. Just one leap, a pounce, and a moment of pause as if trying to understand why that felt right. Walter laughed. Really laughed. Shadow cocked his head, then tail moving slightly. That afternoon, Walter drove into town and bought a pack of tennis balls. He also bought a whiteboard, hung it in the garage. At the top, in thick black marker, he wrote, Shadow's duty schedule, 0600 PT 0800 Chow 0900 drill, commands agility, 1100 rest, 1300 neighborhood perimeter check, 1600. Free time, 1800. Dinner, 1900. Quiet watch. He didn't care if the neighbors thought he was nuts. Truth was, they already did. Old man with a ghost dog in a garage. But Walter didn't care. Shadow cared. Each command sharpened him. Each routine gave him back a sliver of who he'd been before the fire, before the betrayal, before the silence. Walter noticed other things too. Shadow began eating every meal, no longer needing coaxing. His body filled out, muscles returning beneath the soot-stained coat. His eyes began to flick instead of stare. One morning, Walter found Shadow sitting by the front door before dawn, posture upright. Not anxious, just waiting. For what? Walter muttered. The day's orders? He opened the door. Shadow walked out, paused at the top of the steps, and scanned the street. Like a soldier on sentry. It wasn't lost on Walter how familiar it all felt. The early mornings, the repetition, the sense that you were part of something bigger, even if it was just two living beings trying to rebuild from ruin. That night, Walter poured himself a glass of cheap bourbon and sat beside Shadow on the back steps. "You missed the mission, huh?" he said. "Don't worry, you've got one again." Shadow didn't move. But a moment later, he rested his head on Walter's boot. And for the first time since he'd been pulled from that burning shelter, Shadow slept without flinching in his dreams. Outside, an owl called into the dark. Walter didn't answer. He was listening to Shadow breathe, slow, even, peaceful. The mission had begun. And maybe, just maybe, this time it would save them both. It was supposed to be a normal walk, just a stretch down the old canal trail behind the elementary school, where Shadow liked to scan the horizon like he was still running patrol. Walter had brought a thermos of lukewarm coffee and a chew toy Lucy had insisted Shadow carry. But Shadow had dropped the toy 3 blocks back. He was focused, tense. His posture had shifted. Walter noticed it before the sound. The way Shadow's head rose, ears pivoted forward, tail stiffened. Not wagging, not raised, but anchored. A low growl rumbled from Shadow's chest. Not the angry kind, not warning. Something closer to recognition. Confusion tangled with certainty. Walter followed the dog's stare to the sidewalk ahead. A man limped along the far edge of the street, his left foot dragging slightly, a slight hunch in his shoulders. A stranger to Walter, but not to Shadow. The growl stopped. Shadow sat. Not a command, not fear, deference. Walter's heart slowed. The man wore a faded army green hoodie, the kind issued to medics in-country. His hair was longer now, dark with streaks of grey. Beard trimmed but unkempt. But there was something in his walk that screamed familiarity. The man paused, eyes locking with Walter's, and then flicking to the dog. And he froze. "Oh my God!" he whispered, stumbling forward 2 steps, before stopping short again. Shadow rose, not slowly, not cautiously, with certainty. He stepped forward, one leg, then another, his head tilted, ears back, tail low but steady. The man dropped to his knees. "Shadow?" The man choked. "Is that you?" Walter stepped back instinctively. The air felt too thick, like time had bent and cracked around them. Shadow didn't wait. He lunged forward, but not with force, with urgency. A cry broke from his throat, not a bark, but a fractured sound somewhere between a whimper and a call. He crashed into the man's chest, and for the first time in months, Shadow trembled. His whole body quivered as he nuzzled, pawed, licked, buried his face into the man's neck like a child to a long-lost parent. The man wrapped his arms around him, and then broke, collapsed into sobs right there on the pavement. "I thought you died," he whispered into the fur. "They told me you burned in that shelter. I saw the report. I saw the list." Walter felt his throat tighten. The world narrowed to that single image. The soldier and his dog, one broken by war, one nearly broken by grief, somehow finding each other in a quiet town, miles away from everything that had defined them. Walter cleared his throat. Name's Walter. Found him at a kill shelter 6 towns over. The man looked up, wiping his face with the back of his hand. Evan, he said. Evan Torres. I served with him. Kandahar. He was my dog. He paused, correcting himself. He was my partner. Walter nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Evan sat back, pulling Shadow closer. The dog didn't resist. He just pressed into the embrace, eyes fluttering shut for a moment like he was home. I was listed KIA, Evan said, voice rough. Hit an IED on a solo run. Got dragged out by locals. No comms for days. Docs thought I'd never walk again. I didn't ask for the full report when I came home. I couldn't. Shadow let out a quiet, almost apologetic whine. Evan buried his face into his neck. They told me he died, Evan whispered. Burned in a fire after discharge. I couldn't even bring myself to ask where he was buried. Walter exhaled hard. He wasn't. They dumped him, branded him aggressive. I found him days away from death. Evan closed his eyes. Of course they did. Silence fell, thick and soft. Passing cars slowed, drivers peeking at the strange reunion on the sidewalk. But no one interrupted. Evan finally pulled back slightly, wiping his eyes. He remember me. Walter didn't answer. He didn't have to. Shadow sat beside Evan now, pressed tightly against his thigh, eyes upturned with the kind of loyalty that can't be trained. The kind that survives explosions, distance, and lies. Walter crossed his arms. You looking for him? Evan hesitated. Number I didn't know he was even alive. But now you do? Evan looked down at Shadow, then back at Walter. Yeah, now I do. Another pause, this one heavier. Walter's voice was even. I'm not here to keep what's not mine, but you should know. He saved me too. Evan nodded slowly. And I wouldn't take him away from that. Shadow looked between the two men. He stood up, circled once, and laid down with his head across both of their boots, half on each, as if to settle it himself. Walter chuckled softly. Looks like he's not choosing. Evan smiled for the first time. Looks like he already did. They sat in silence for a long while, strangers no longer, not just linked by a dog, but by the same war, the same wounds, and a partner who refused to give up on either of them. Shadow didn't move. He didn't need to. He was home, wherever that was, and now, somehow, he had both of them. The night was quiet. Too quiet. Walter sat on the back porch, nursing a cup of black coffee gone lukewarm. Shadow lay at his feet, chest rising slow, one ear twitching occasionally as if still listening for distant orders. The porch light buzzed faintly. Crickets filled the silence. And somewhere inside, Lucy was humming to herself, tracing her finger along the glass of the framed photo Evan had given her, a picture of younger soldiers and a dog in the center. Shadow. The porch door creaked open. Evan stepped out, rubbing the back of his neck. His limp had gotten better over the last week, but the fatigue lingered in his eyes. She asleep? Walter asked. Out cold. Girl's got lungs, though. Kept trying to convince me Shadow speaks kid English. Walter allowed himself a dry smile. Evan took a seat beside him. They didn't speak for a while. Just the rhythm of the night and the old dog breathing. Then Evan leaned forward. There's something about her, he said. Lucy. Walter didn't look up. Evan kept going. She has this way of tilting her head when she's trying to figure you out. Same as her mother did. Walter's knuckles tightened around the mug. I've been trying to place it. Evan continued. And today, when she said, I hate broccoli, but I eat it because Gramps says soldiers don't complain, it hit me. That phrase. That was from my second week at base. I said that to Maddie. Walter finally turned to face him. Don't. But Evan wasn't blinking. "Did Maddie ever tell you about us? About what happened just before deployment?" Walter didn't answer. "I thought she ghosted me. She stopped writing after I shipped out. Didn't respond to emails. I figured it was just one of those things. But now I'm sitting across from a little girl who looks like both of us, who counts months backward on her fingers before she speaks." Evan's voice dropped. "She's mine, isn't she?" Walter set his mug down slowly. Shadow stirred, but didn't move. He looked out into the night, jaw clenched. "Maddie was sick," he said finally. "She had Lucy and never told anyone who the father was. Not even me. Not until the—" and Evan's breath caught. "She left a letter," Walter added. "She told me everything, but she made me promise not to contact you. She said she didn't want you to come back out of guilt or duty. She wanted you to finish healing if you ever got that chance." Evan stood, fists clenched at his sides, eyes burning. "You had no right." "She was my daughter," Walter growled, standing too. "And Lucy needed someone stable, someone who wouldn't disappear again. I didn't disappear. I nearly died. And she thought you were dead." Silence cut between them like a bayonet. Shadow stood, body poised between the two men, watching, waiting. Evan turned away, running a hand over his face. "So all these years, she never knew. Lucy doesn't know." "No," Walter said. "I raised her as my own. I thought I was doing the right thing." Evan swallowed hard. "And now?" Walter's voice softened. "Now I don't know." The screen door squeaked again. Both men turned. Lucy stood barefoot in the doorway, her oversized pajama shirt trailing down to her knees. She held the photo frame in one hand. Her eyes were red. "You lied," she whispered. "Both of you." "Lucy," Walter stepped forward. She pulled back, holding the photo like a shield. "You said Daddy died in a crash. Mommy too. You said I was special because I was born into a storm, but you never said anything about him." She looked at Evan. "You're the soldier with the dog." Evan's voice cracked. "Yeah, sweetheart, I think I am." Lucy looked down at Shadow. The dog walked over slowly, sat beside her, and nudged her leg gently. She reached out and stroked his head. Then she looked up at the two men. "So who's going to tell me the rest?" No one spoke. Shadow let out a soft huff, as if to say someone better. Walter crouched beside her, eyes glossy. "Lucy, your mom loved you more than anything. She did what she thought was right." "I don't care about what she thought," Lucy said quietly. "I want to know what's real now." Evan knelt on her other side. "I didn't know, Lucy. If I had, I would have come back sooner." She looked at him for a long time. "Can you prove it?" The question hit like a punch, but Evan didn't flinch. "No," he said. "I can only show you." They stood there, 3 generations in a triangle, the dog at the center. Shadow looked between them, tail giving a slow, measured wag. The truth was out, and it didn't shatter them. It changed them, but not in a way that broke, in a way that might finally begin to heal. It started with a thump, not a loud one, just a soft, almost inaudible thud from the hallway, then a sound like a mug hitting tile, then silence. Shadow heard it first. The old dog was napping under the kitchen table, one eye half closed, a paw twitching in a dream that likely smelled of desert wind and diesel fuel. But when the sound came, again, this time a gasp, strangled and dry. Shadow surged to his feet like a soldier on call. In the hallway, Walter was crumpled against the wall, one hand clutching his chest, the other still loosely gripping the edge of a picture frame that had slipped from its hook. His face was pale, lips tinged blue. Sweat beaded along his temples. Shadow reached him in seconds. He barked. Once, loud, not his usual bark, not a warning or a command. This was a shockwave, a signal. Then again, short, sharp, precise. Lucy was the first to react, running from the living room with her sketchpad still in hand. "Shadow?" she called, voice uncertain. Then she saw Walter. "Grandpa!" Her scream brought Evan barreling in from the backyard, but Shadow wasn't done. As if channeling every ounce of training, instinct, and memory, the dog leaned his full weight into Walter's side, keeping him upright, nudging his phone out of his vest pocket with his snout. Then he barked again, pointed at the phone. Evan understood. He dove to his knees, fumbled the phone open, and dialed 911 with shaking fingers. "We've got a cardiac emergency," he snapped. 68-year-old male, conscious but fading. The dispatcher began instructions. Evan followed. Compressions. Monitoring. Reassuring words Lucy tried desperately to echo, even through her tears. Shadow didn't leave Walter's side. Not once. He pressed close, nose to Walter's chest, as if urging his heartbeat to hold the line. His body was still. Eyes locked on his former handler's face. He didn't whimper. He didn't shake. He simply stayed. The ambulance arrived in under 8 minutes. The EMTs later said if the call had come even 2 minutes later, the outcome would have been different. When they loaded Walter onto the gurney, Shadow whined for the first time in days. The old man's hand twitched, then reached weakly and brushed the top of Shadow's head. And Shadow wagged. Walter survived. A minor heart attack, the doctors said. Stress, probably years in the making. He'd be fine with rest, medication, and someone watching his salt. He got more than that. Evan moved into the guest room within the week. The house that had long echoed with old air and quiet clocks now buzzed with new rhythms. Lucy's chatter, the low hum of Evan's guitar at night, and the unmistakable padding of Shadow's feet as he made his rounds. He became what Lucy called a double-duty dog. He'd wait by Walter's side during breakfast, nudge Evan's hand during his VA check-in calls, and curl beside Lucy when she read her books out loud in the sunroom. He responded to all three, no confusion, no hesitation, as if he finally had the unit he'd been waiting for. Lucy began calling Evan Dad one evening without ceremony. She was setting the table, placing mismatched plates carefully, and casually said, "Dad, can you pass the forks?" Evan froze. She didn't look up, just kept arranging. Napkins. He passed the forks. Later that night, he sat beside Walter, both of them watching Lucy paint flowers on the porch railing. Evan's voice cracked when he finally said, "You gave her everything I didn't know how to give." Walter didn't speak right away. Then he said, "She gave it right back." Shadow barked once, as if in agreement. The next morning, Walter walked out to the porch in slippers, coffee in one hand, a piece of toast in the other. Shadow was sitting there, straight-backed, watching the sunrise. His coat had grown thick again. His eyes were clear. The limp from his burns was barely noticeable now. "Morning, soldier," Walter said. Shadow turned and, maybe it was the light, or maybe something deeper, his eyes looked right through Walter and into something older than memory. And then he did something Walter hadn't seen him do in over a year. He play-bowed, tail high, chest low, eyes shining. Walter laughed, a full-bellied sound that startled a bird from the fence post. Shadow leapt up, nudged the toast from Walter's hand, and took off down the yard, daring someone to chase him. Walter followed, wheezing and laughing. Inside, Evan looked out the window, shaking his head. "Your grandpa's going to throw out his back again." Lucy grinned. "That's okay. Shadow's got his 6. The house that had once felt like a tomb for memory now pulsed with life. Shared dinners, laughter, late-night stories, healing that didn't come in grand declarations, but in the steady, loyal rhythm of a dog who had once stopped barking, and now had found his voice again. The air was warm for late October, soft with the scent of dry leaves and distant chimney smoke. The old community hall had never looked like this before. Folding chairs neatly aligned, flags on every window, and a crowd that hummed with quiet reverence. Shadow didn't bark. He didn't need to. He sat center stage, his coat gleaming under the morning sun streaming through the skylight. The Medal of Military Honor for Valor hung lightly around his neck, though the weight of what he'd carried was known only to a few. Walter stood off to the side, hands folded loosely in front of him. His suit was a little too snug at the shoulders. He hadn't worn it since his retirement ceremony, but it still fit where it counted. His chest. Behind him, Lucy stepped to the podium, 12 years old and unshakable. She took a breath. "He wasn't just a dog," she said. "He was the one who taught us how to stay." Silence settled over the room like snowfall. A woman in the third row dabbed her eyes. A veteran near the aisle stood a little taller. Lucy went on. "When my grandpa forgot how to laugh, Shadow stayed. When my dad came back from the dead, Shadow stayed. When we didn't know who we were to each other, he waited until we figured it out. And when things were broken, he laid down next to them until we picked the pieces up." She looked down at the dog beside her. Shadow's ears flicked. His tail thumped once. "I used to think heroes wore capes or uniforms," she said. "Now I know they also have paws." Applause came slowly, then rose like a wave, thunderous, unrestrained, and Shadow, calm as ever, merely turned his head toward Walter, as if asking permission to enjoy it. Walter's chest tightened, not from fear this time, from something quieter, something earned. He looked around, at Lucy, at Evan, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder, pride etched deep into the lines of his face. At the crowd, neighbors, soldiers, kids with handmade signs that read, "Thank you, Shadow." At the walls, once drafty and bare, now holding warmth, applause, memory. And finally at the dog. A soldier, a healer, a bridge, a damn miracle. The ceremony ended with a standing ovation and a slow march of people who came to shake Walter's hand, pat Evan's back, and kneel to run their hands along Shadow's fur. He didn't flinch. He didn't shift. He accepted each gesture like a statesman, dignified, steady. That afternoon, back at the house, Walter settled into his usual chair on the porch. The same one where he once drank alone and counted the cracks in the steps. Now the porch held pumpkins Lucy had carved, potted mums in full bloom, and a wind chime Evan had fixed. Shadow lay curled at Walter's feet, eyes closed but ears alert. "You know," Walter said aloud, mostly to the wind, "I spent my whole life thinking I had to keep moving." That stopping meant weakness. Shadow opened one eye. Walter smiled. Turns out, staying is the hard part. Lucy stepped outside with 2 mugs of hot cider. She handed one to Walter, kissed the top of Shadow's head, and curled up beside him with a book. Evan followed with his guitar. No songs, just soft chords that blended with the breeze. For the first time in decades, Walter's heart didn't feel like a clock counting down. It felt like something starting. He looked around at the family he never expected to have, the home he never expected to rebuild, and the dog who somehow knew exactly when to stand still and when to move. And then, quietly, as the last light of the day turned the sky to gold, Walter asked a question he hadn't dared before. "What's your story with a loyal pet?" He wasn't asking anyone in particular. Maybe the trees, maybe the sky, maybe you, because there's a good chance you have one. A dog who waited by the door, a cat who sat on your chest when grief hit, a creature who knew when you were breaking long before anyone else did. Their stories matter, Shadows did. And if you've been moved by his, if it reminded you of something deep, something real, we invite you to be part of this journey. Support the voices that honor them. Subscribe to the German Shepherd channel. Share your story. Pass it on. Because loyalty like this, it deserves to stay.